Good evening, and thank you all again for joining me for this conversation. My name is Luther Young. My pronouns are he, him. I currently serve as a board member for Q Christian Fellowship, and I serve in a number of other capacities that I won't bore you with those minor details right now. But this evening, we are going to talk about LGBTQ plus people and identities in its relationship to the Black church. And in particular, we'll talk about this with the backdrop of liberation theology, which is something that is foundational to the Black church. And while this presentation specifically addresses the experiences of Black people, it could very easily be applied to other non-white racial and ethnic groups. Just as a forewarning, this conversation, this presentation will include sensitive topics such as homophobia, sexual violence, and racism. And so I begin this conversation, this discussion, by asking the question that's on the screen. Are Black people less less tolerant than perhaps white folks or other racial ethnic groups when it comes to LGBTQ plus communities and identities, right? Have we heard that Black people are just more homophobic, they're more transphobic, right? And that's just a fact. This is something that perhaps we've heard, perhaps we haven't. But then my next question is, do we think this statement is true? Do we think that Black people, that our communities of color are less tolerant of LGBTQ plus identities? And so my line of research, I examined this very question. And so there's been a lot of research to suggest, and if you look at these studies that use these national surveys where they interview, a representative sample of the United States, and they look and they see that, well, on average, Black folks tend to have less tolerant views, right? So they'll ask these questions, do you think homosexuality is wrong, right? And more times than not, we find that Black people will respond to this question and say, yes, it is wrong, more so than perhaps other groups. And so we see this research, and there's decades of research on this, but then there's little research on why we see those trends, right? So why are Black people answering these questions in this way? And so some speculate, right? Researchers speculate that this is because of religion, right? So it's the Black church, it's the conservative religious views of Black people that is leading them to have these more conservative views about gender and sexuality. But there is not necessarily agreement in the research on this either. And so I'm going to skip over that part. So I raised the question, what is the relationship between the Black church and, this intolerance or the views of Black people concerning LGBTQ plus identities and people? Why do we see this trend, this alleged trend, that Black people are less accepting? But before we can answer this question, we must look at how religion and sexuality function in the Black church. So we need some more context. And so going way back, getting the context, we have to look at the Black church for what it is. And the Black church provides congregants a space for liberation, catharsis, and healing. historically, the Black church is a place where folks can be, if only temporarily, free from the oppression of the world. It's a place where they don't have to worry about their pain and their struggle, and they can find freedom, right? Even if they can't find freedom in the world, they can find freedom in the presence of God. It's at church where the Black people can release their pain and the pressures they endured during the week. The standards of appropriate conduct don't necessarily apply. They can scream, they can shout, all the things that society kind of demonizes Black people for being too loud, being too emotional, all of these things that we hear on a daily basis. It doesn't necessarily apply in the church. Men can cry, and it be okay because we are all in this space together. And furthermore, a lot of the theology and the preaching in the Black church adopts this theology of liberation that expressly condemns racism, right? And generally understands God as someone who cares for and will avenge the oppressed. So at church, one is not an N-word, but a beloved child of God. But this theology of liberation has had its limitations. And so, it most freely applies to Black men. And, sometimes it applies to Black women here recently, but almost never to Black LGBTQ plus individuals. So then my question becomes, why is this the case, right? Why is this theology of liberation not equally applied across the board? And so I'll go back to slavery in the US. Now, it's important to note that Black history doesn't start with slavery. I think it's important to name that. But it is a significant disruption in the history of Black people in this country. And so under slavery, it was not uncommon for slaveholders to have relations or, to sexually assault their slaves in order to instill fear and to exert power. A white slave owner could rape African women, and they would do this not only for their own, perverted reasons of gratification, but also to emasculate the African men, right? To say that you are incapable of protecting your family, so you are less than men. And if an enslaved man were to try and intervene, he too might be sexually assaulted. And so because of this, some Black people view same gender relations or homosexuality as a tool of emasculation. It was something that was introduced to Black people forcibly through slavery. And so some Black people are of the mind that, homosexuality is a white man's disease, right? That's a white man's perversion that was forced upon Black people. And so not only that, you have the fact that enslaved people were treated like cattle or livestock. They didn't have their own sexual agency. They were forced to breed with one another, sometimes even with their own relatives, in order to just reproduce more workers. And this denied them the opportunity to establish stable family units. But despite all this, ironically, the dominant society considered Black people to be sexual deviants, right? They depict Black men as the dangerous rapists, even though, history is saying something else. And then the dominant society also depicts Black women as these sensual seductresses, right? Almost kind of, blaming the victims, right? These African women, well, they were too busy walking around tempting these slave masters. And that's why these relations happened. So after slavery officially ended, allegedly, Black people sought to subvert this dominant narrative that depicted them as sexual savages by adopting what Kelly Brown Douglas calls a hyper-proper sexual ethic, or what Evelyn Higginbotham terms respectability politics. And so that is in response to the polemics that painted Black people as overly sexual. Black people, in turn, embraced these very conservative views on sexuality. You know, they sought to reestablish the Black family with the male-headed, families. And in this way, same gender relations, non-normative gender identities, anything that went against the heterosexist cisnormative worldview became antithetical to the Black identity, right? So if you were off doing these things, you were hurting the cause of Black people trying to get free in some people's minds. And so in that way, the struggle for Black liberation did not include the issues facing queer folks, right? So we see this most notably during the civil rights movement. There was not as much of an inclusion of queer people or queer issues of that movement. The queer folks of that time, Black queer folks, were kind of told, "Hey, wait your turn. We gotta fix racism first, and then we'll kind of see about that whole gay thing later on." And so that attention wasn't given. And so the relationship between LGBTQ plus people and the Black church remains complicated because the Black church was pretty involved in putting forth these conservative sexual views, right? They became not only functional in the sense that, socially, but they also became quite functional spiritually, right? So it's like we have these social goals, but then we can kind of tie it to the Bible and spiritualize it. We can say, well, it's because God said that you need to do this. And so torn between being a member of the community, one of the kids, and being a child of God, queer Black folks often struggle to reconcile gender, racial, and their sexual identities. And so, this shows Richard Troyden posits there are 4 stages of identity development. And then Richard Pitt takes it a bit further and says there are 4 ways that queer people can recognize their sexual, and this focuses specifically on sexual identities, but can also be used to talk about gender identity as well, how they reconcile their LGBTQ plus identity with their religious identity, right? So they can reject their LGBTQ identity outright, in which they may try to pray the gay away, so to speak. They can reject religion, right? And say, you know what? I'm done with religion. I'm going to live my best life as a queer person. Or they may try to compartmentalize those 2 things. I kind of keep my church stuff over here. I kind of keep my, my queer stuff over here. And so in those instances, folks may try to pass in their, day-to-day lives, or especially at church, or, have relations. Somebody mentioned earlier on the DL. Or this final one is they can fully integrate, right? They can accept both their LGBTQ plus identity and their religious identity. And this is often difficult for Black LGBTQ plus people, and we'll talk a little bit more about that throughout the rest of this presentation. And in particular, a lot of my research in the past focused specifically on gay Black men, because in the Black church, they perpetuate these patriarchal and heterosexist, ideologies. And there's a lot of emphasis on gay men in particular. Like whenever, they talk about LGBTQ stuff, there's this particular disdain for gay men, perhaps more so than lesbian women, bisexual folks, or other queer folks. And as a result, as I said, my work is focused on gay men in particular. Gay Black men face a unique set of challenges because in addition to negotiating their religious and sexual identities, they must often also reckon with how their sexual orientation might conflict with their identity as a Black man. And so Raywin Connell, a wonderful scholar of masculinities, Their gender theory of masculinity suggests that men and boys are socialized to measure their masculinity in terms of their ability to exert power over women and other men. But disparities in policing, in education, and the labor force make it difficult for Black men to secure power via these traditional means. So Black men aren't as able to achieve wealth and high status. And so the physical body becomes a primary avenue through which Black men, especially those of lower socioeconomic status, that's a way that they can best perform masculinity, according to Connell. And so by being tough and aggressive with other men and sexually dominating women, that fulfills the requirement for a lot of Black men, as I said, especially Black men of lower socioeconomic status, to claim their masculinity. And therefore, same gender relationships pose as a threat to Black masculinity, right? So this is one of those ways we can see how race and gender and sexuality, but also class kind of comes into play with this topic of LGBTQ plus identities in Black communities. And so, as I said a moment ago, the Black church has been really instrumental in helping to perpetuate some of these heterosexist ideologies. Debates about scriptural interpretation factor into that, more conservative theologies and a lot of particularly Black denominations and Black churches. And given that Black people, on average, studies show, statistics show that Black people tend to be religious people. Lots of Black people go to church more so than those that do not. It kind of stands to reason, right? Why researchers have said, oh yeah, it's religion that does this. But one must also look at all of these other things that I've talked about, right? The history of slavery, racism, patriarchy, all of these things are at play here. And so the big point about this talk is that conversations about gender and sexuality have to be intersectional. And so I always say that these issues of homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, other forms of intolerance against queer folks are not simple matters of ideological difference. It's not just a difference of opinion, but they have tangible impacts on people's lives, right? So we have research, Mark Katzenbuehler does great work that shows that experiencing discrimination, right, LGBTQ plus discrimination, has negative impacts on queer people's health, right? And so, and I also have a study that's coming out, I'm working on with some colleagues at Vanderbilt, in which we find that experiencing heterosexist discrimination from within one's own racial group negatively impacts LGBTQ plus people of color. So we see that not only do you have these negative impacts, but when you look at LGBTQ plus people of color, and in our study, especially Black queer people, it has even more detrimental impacts. And then two, this is also interesting to me. Mark Katzenbuehler also did a study where he found that holding prejudice against other groups was associated with decreased life expectancy among heterosexual people, right? So in other words, being a bigot will literally kill you, right? So homophobia benefits no one. Transphobia benefits no one. Discrimination benefits no, it's literally killing all of us. And so it is incumbent upon us to do as much as possible to reduce these inequalities and to reduce this discrimination. So what is the relationship between the Black church and the increase in tolerance of LGBTQ identities in the Black community? Well, I conclude that it is not simply a matter or a case that Black people are more intolerant because they're more religious, right? Like, I don't think that it's that simple. There's some research, to suggest that the racial differences that we see could actually be a function of class, or it could be a function of geography, right? So it's not that Black people are more intolerant, it's just that it's really what we're seeing are class differentials, or it could be based on where people live. And when you take that into account, the differences between the racial and ethnic groups are virtually non-existent. But in any case, we know that gender and sexuality function in unique ways for Black people as a result of slavery and racial oppression. And as such, sexual identity for queer Black people is complicated. And so back to the question posed at the beginning of the conversation, are Black people more intolerant? Well, if so, it's because, is it because the Black church is, intolerant, and the Black church's views, influence Black people? Well, to that question, I don't really have an answer for you. The research is inconclusive. I know I did a whole lot of talking to tell you at the end. I don't know. But to the second question of, is it because of the Black church? I have some thoughts. And so I have an article coming out later this year. It was just accepted for publication, so hopefully you all will be able to read it soon, in which I find that although Black churches tend to be non-affirming, this non-affirmation doesn't look the same across the Black church as a whole, right? The Black church isn't necessarily this monolithic, immovably homophobic institution. And then furthermore, I find that Black people who go to church ingest and interpret the messages from their churches in a myriad of ways. So it's not just simply this indoctrination of intolerant views, right? It's much more nuanced than that. In another paper that I'm writing, hopefully that'll be available early next year, I find that many Black people disagree with how their churches and their congregations handle LGBTQ plus matters. They often call for more open and honest dialogue about these topics. And then I have another article that, I do a lot of research, lots of things. And I find that the views of the Black church have migrated over time, right? The Black church, these kind of more homophobic, transphobic views that we see kind of pop up here and there are actually quite new. The Black church has largely been pretty welcoming of queer folks, maybe not openly, but they're there. They've been directing the choirs, they've been serving in churches, and people have been fine. They've been fine with it. But this kind of vocal, homophobic, transphobic rhetoric has really just recently emerged in like the 90s with this kind of rise in conservative partisan politics. I mean, I don't want to go into all of that right now, but to conclude, we must remember that work to decrease discrimination against LGBTQ plus individuals requires nuance, right? So our open and affirming efforts that we deploy in our predominantly white churches and organizations may not necessarily work in the same way with our communities of color, right? Because Black LGBTQ plus people face unique challenges as Black people, as queer people, and as queer Black people, right? That's intersectionality. And on top of that, it's slim pickings for a lot of us to be able to find a church with people who look like us, who embody a faith tradition that is familiar and important to many of us. And so if we leave our congregations, we may never find another faith community that we truly love. And sure, we can leave and find an affirming church, but a lot of our affirming churches are predominantly white. And let's be honest, queer white folks can be racist as hell. And so many are forced to kind of choose between the lesser of two evils. And many choose to stay in non-affirming churches because we literally have nowhere else to go. So let's bear all of this in mind when we work together, when we worship together, and when we collectively do the work of justice.